Welcome to the debate. When we look at the night sky through a high-powered telescope, the clarity of the stars doesn't just depend on what is actually out there in the universe.
Right, it's about the equipment.
Exactly. It depends almost entirely on the lens, the atmospheric interference, and the exact calibration of the instrument you're looking through. A slight smudge on the glass, or like a lens that is misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter, and a vibrant, distant galaxy just looks like a meaningless, blurry artifact.
And the real danger in that scenario is, well, what happens next? Because if you don't know the smudge is there, you might rewrite your entire map of the cosmos based on a speck of dust. You end up building a whole diagnostic universe on a structural flaw.
I love that framing, and that concept translates perfectly from the vastness of the cosmos down to the micro level of human biology. A smudge on a lens can rewrite the stars, but a smudge on an ultrasound, a misread fraction of a millimeter, can completely rewrite the course of a pregnancy.
Which is exactly what we're digging into today.
Yeah. That is the 2026 landscape of first-trimester prenatal screening we are exploring today. Specifically, we are analyzing the nuchal translucency, or NT measurement. For those tracking the evolution of fetal medicine, NT is the ultrasound evaluation of the tiny, fluid-filled space behind a developing fetus's neck.
Right, and this discussion emerges from a massive 2026 evidence synthesis. We're looking at the strict 2025 consensus standards from the Fetal Medicine Foundation and ISUOG, the historical context of landmark trials like BUN, SIRRHOS, and FASTER, and the most recent meta-analyses on fetal abnormalities.
Which brings us to the core question we are debating today. We now live in an era dominated by highly sensitive cell-free DNA screening, where we can draw a pregnant person's blood and analyze fragments of placental DNA to check for chromosomal conditions.
Right, the cfDNA era.
Exactly. So in this modern era, does the ultrasound NT measurement remain an indispensable, standalone pillar of prenatal care? Does it justify strict universal enforcement and aggressive clinical action at lower thresholds like 3.0 millimeters?
Or is the NT measurement inherently flawed as a standalone tool because of its extreme dependence on the human operating the ultrasound and deep methodological biases in the foundational data? Should its role be fundamentally demoted?
And to layer cards on the table, I am arguing that rigorous NT measurement retains critical independent prognostic value for structural and genetic morbidity across all thresholds.
And I am arguing that NT should simply be a secondary marker, and we need to push clinical intervention thresholds much higher to 3.5 or 4.0 millimeters to avoid putting patients through a cascade of completely unnecessary medical interventions.
Okay, so let me unpack why I see NT as a vital, irreplaceable tool. It gives us a holistic, physiological view of fetal health that genetics just cannot provide.
Okay, but genetics? Well, hang on. Cell-free DNA is incredible, but it only looks at the genetic blueprint. It doesn't tell you if the house is actually being built correctly.
But the issue is how often we misread the blueprint versus how often we misread the ultrasound screen.
Let's look at the 2025 data from the Gadsboll and Bianchi studies. They showed that even when that cell-free DNA blood test comes back completely normal, if you have a fetus with an NT measurement between 2.5 and 3.4 millimeters, there is still a 1 in 30 risk of major structural anomalies.
A 1 in 30 risk?
Think about that, 1 in 30. And if that NT hits 3.5 millimeters, it carries a 4 to 5% risk of pathogenic microarray findings. These are, tiny genetic microdeletions that the standard blood test entirely misses.
I mean, I don't dispute that the pathology exists, but the foundation we've built this test on is incredibly fragile when you use it as the primary trigger for major medical procedures.
Fragile how?
The root of this weakness lies in the extreme operator dependency, and frankly, the spectrum bias baked into those foundational studies you're referencing.
I completely disagree. The 2025 FMF and ISUOG standards demand exacting precision. You can't just casually measure the neck.
But people do.
Not under the guidelines. The fetus has to have a crown rump length exactly between 45 and 84 millimeters, meaning the fetus is roughly the size of a plum. If it's 44 or 85, you literally can't use the chart.
Right.
The fetus must be in a perfectly neutral position, and the image has to be magnified by over 75%. When strictly followed, these criteria completely validate NT's continuous utility.
In theory, yes, but when you evaluate the systematic reviews of NT diagnostic accuracy out in the wild, you see profound methodological flaws. There is differential verification bias everywhere,
Well,
and the heterogeneity across these studies is extreme. We are looking at I-squared values over 90%.
Okay, let's translate that for a second for everyone listening. An I-squared over 90%.
Right, imagine trying to bake a cake using 20 different recipes at the exact same time, and then trying to judge the final flavor. If the I-squared is over 90%, it means the studies you are mathematically combining to create your guidelines are so wildly different in how they were conducted, what populations they looked at, and how they measured outcomes, that pooling their results is basically statistical malpractice.
Statistical malpractice is a strong term.
You are comparing apples to bicycles. It fundamentally undermines the stability of the pooled diagnostic metrics we use to counsel patients. That is exactly why aggressively pursuing a low threshold, like 3.0 millimeters, is a flawed policy.
So what's your alternative?
We should be implementing the Hui et al. 2021 recommendation, raising the intervention threshold to 3.5 or 4.0 millimeters in the cell-free DNA era.
Look, we need to separate the biological reality of the measurement from the clinical application of it. We must first establish if the measurement itself can be trusted in real-world clinical settings before discussing how to act on its results.
And I'm saying it can't be trusted reliably enough to act on a 3.0 millimeter reading.
but the biological reality of nuchal fluid accumulation is undeniable. If a fetus has transient cardiac dysfunction, meaning, the tiny heart is struggling to pump for a few weeks, or if the lymphatic system is delayed in its development, fluid backs up and pools behind the neck.
Yes, physiologically that happens.
It is a brilliant early physiological distress signal, and to capture it accurately, we aren't just trusting humans blindly. We have the 2025 FMF Quality Assurance Framework,
Which is a mathematical utopia that doesn't exist in a busy standard ultrasound suite.
It absolutely exists. This isn't just about a sonographer taking a weekend credentialing course. We have continuous clinical audits. We track what's called the logarithmic standard deviation of the multiple of the median, or MOM.
Which sounds great on paper.
We use real-time cumulative sum charts, or QSUM charts. Think of QSUM like a highly sensitive financial ledger, but instead of tracking pennies, it tracks tiny visual errors over hundreds of scans. If a sonographer is consistently overmeasuring or undermeasuring by even a fraction of a millimeter over time, the math catches the drift and flags it. The system actively corrects human error.
I mean, you can audit the human all you want, but you cannot audit your way out of acoustic physics. Let's be real here. Let's look at the physical limitations inside the womb.
Okay.
In approximately 5% of all first-trimester scans, you have a nuchal cord. The umbilical cord is wrapped around the fetal neck. That physical presence either compresses the fluid, artificially reducing the measurement, or the sonographer accidentally includes the cord's wall diameter, artificially inflating it.
The guidelines explicitly account for that.
But wait, it gets worse with the actual technology we use. Modern ultrasound machines default to tissue harmonic imaging, or THI, to improve general image clarity. But THI creates a well-documented ghosting effect.
Well, yes, THI does have artifacts.
It literally makes the white lines on the ultrasound screen, the echogenic lines of the fetal skin and the amniotic membrane, appear thicker than the actual biological tissue. So you could have a sonographer with a perfect CUSAM chart who perfectly places their digital calipers exactly where the machine shows the line, but the image itself is projecting a biological falsehood.
Okay, but treating NT as an inherently flawed concept just because the physics of modern imaging require adjustment is like blaming a high-precision microscope for a blurry image when the user simply forgot to focus the lens.
It's not the same thing.
It is. The tool isn't the problem. The adherence to the 0.1 millimeter measurement precision rule is. And the guidelines explicitly instruct sonographers on how to handle these exact scenarios.
But humans are fallible under pressure.
which is why the protocol dictates that if tissue harmonic imaging is used, you place the calipers slightly inside the echogenic lines to account for that specific artificial thickening. If there's a nuchal cord wrapped around the neck, you don't just guess. You measure the fluid above the cord, you measure below the cord, and you average the two. The methodology has evolved to neutralize the physics.
And yet, because the measurement is so incredibly sensitive to technique, we are arguing over the thickness of a fingernail here, the exact threshold at which you trigger downstream testing becomes the most consequential debate we have.
Right.
That perfectly audited sonographer still has to decide what to do when they get a reading of exactly 3.0 millimeters. And that is where the math collides with human anxiety.
Let's talk about that threshold then. Because I fiercely defend the 3.0 millimeter cutoff, and I defend it using the 2025 Go et al. Study. They looked at 4,200 pregnancies. Do you know what the adverse pregnancy outcome rate was for an NT of 3.0 millimeters or greater?
I know the paper.
It was 31.5%. We are talking about major structural malformations and severe genetic morbidities. Nearly 1 in 3 fetuses at that 3.0 threshold had a serious issue.
But what about the other 2 out of 3?
If we adopt your approach and wait for an NT to hit 3.5 millimeters, or worse, 4.0, before we trigger an intervention, we are abandoning a massive cohort of fetuses. We would miss undetected heart defects or monogenic syndromes like rhaesiopathies.
Okay, but
These are rare genetic syndromes like Noonan syndrome that cell-free DNA completely misses because they are microscopic misspellings in single genes, not whole missing chromosomes. We would be flying blind.
You're framing this as abandoning patients, but I am looking at the systemic resource and equity implications. Lowering a static threshold from 3.5 millimeters down to 3.0 isn't just adjusting a number on a page. You're exponentially increasing the volume of invasive diagnostic procedures.
Procedures that yield critical answers.
Procedures that carry real physical and psychological weight. We're talking about chorionic villus sampling, where we take a piece of the placenta, or amniocentesis, where we put a needle into the amniotic sac. We are driving up the costs of genome-wide microarrays astronomically.
But that's the cost of thorough care.
this is exactly why the UK NICE guidelines refuse to rely on absolute low-level NT cutoffs. Instead, they use combined risk algorithms setting a risk cutoff of 1 in 150. They do this because if you trigger testing at 3.0, based solely on the next measurement, you introduce massive anxiety and procedural risk to a huge cohort of patients whose fetuses are perfectly healthy.
But if the data clearly shows a dose-response relationship where the risk materially increases even between 3.0 and 3.4 millimeters, aren't we doing a disservice by artificially raising the threshold to 3.5 millimeters just to save laboratory resources?
It is not just about saving laboratory budgets. Have you considered what a materially increased risk actually means to a patient in the real world?
Of course I have.
Yes, statistically, the risk is elevated at 3.0. But the absolute probability of a normal, healthy, live birth in that 3.0 to 3.4 millimeter window is still around 93%.
93% is high, but 7% is a very real clinical risk.
But when you set the hard threshold at 3.0, you are functionally stating that a 7% risk justifies submitting the other 93% of that cohort to the psychological trauma of a high-risk diagnosis. Think about the cascade of medicalization.
Trauma is a strong word for a diagnostic pathway.
A patient comes in for a routine scan, sees a 3.0, and suddenly their pregnancy is treated as an emergency. And this impacts equity severely. In a highly funded top-tier academic center, that patient gets rapid access to genetic counseling and advanced microarrays. Within days, they clear the false positive.
Which proves the system works when properly resourced.
But what about under-resourced settings? For a patient at a rural clinic, that 3.0 measurement hangs over them for weeks or months because they don't have access to confirmatory testing or specialists. They sit in terror. Raising the threshold to 3.5 millimeters, which is the 99th percentile of normal, is about protecting patients from a cascade of medical harm when the vast majority of them are carrying completely healthy pregnancies.
I hear the empathy in that argument. I completely understand the desire to protect patients from the agonizing wait and the anxiety of a false positive. But I argue we protect them best with accurate, early information. And if human error and the anxiety of threshold balancing are the core issues here, we must look at how emerging technologies are resolving this impasse.
Oh, here we go.
Artificial intelligence is stepping in as the ultimate equalizer.
AI and ultrasound is a minefield of overpromises right now.
Just hear me out. We have deep learning models today, like DeepLab v3, that boast a 94% accuracy in distinguishing a standard mid-sagittal plane from a non-standard one.
Right.
It literally tells the human, you don't have the right angle, do not take this measurement. And when it does measure, it achieves what's called a 0.897 Dice coefficient for segmenting the NT region.
A Dice coefficient doesn't mean it's biologically right.
A Dice coefficient of near 0.90 essentially means there is a 90% perfect overlap between where the AI draws the fluid boundary and where a world-class master sonographer would draw it. AI standardizes the gatekeeping of image quality. It removes the operator dependency you've been highlighting. And wait, furthermore, an accurate NT is now the vital gateway for trio exome sequencing. Exome sequencing is phenomenal. It reads every protein coding letter of the genome for both parents and the fetus. When structural findings accompany an increased NT, exome sequencing yields up to a 40% diagnostic success rate. AI perfects the image, and genomics provide the exact, undeniable answer.
I appreciate the optimism, but we need to expose the severe methodological flaws in current AI claims before we hand over the diagnostic keys to algorithms. You're citing these high accuracy rates, but let's look closely at the data feeding them.
The data is robust.
Is it? Take the Chin et al. 2025 study, which proposed a transfer learning model for Down syndrome prediction using ultrasound imagery. The study has fatal sample size defects.
Well, they utilize data augmentation to handle the smaller sample size, which is a very standard machine learning practice.
They used extreme class imbalance remediation. Do you know what they actually did?
Yes, they augmented the images.
They artificially augmented just 12 positive ultrasound images into 96 training examples. It's the equivalent of taking a single photograph of a diseased apple, applying a dozen different Instagram filters to it, flipping it, changing the contrast, zooming in, and then telling the AI you have a massive orchard of unique diseased fruit.
Okay, Instagram filters is a bit of a snarky comparison.
But it's true. They cloned and tweaked a tiny data set to teach the algorithm without any external validation. You cannot build a clinical standard on a synthetic hallucination.
Okay, that is a fair critique of that specific study's predictive model.
And regarding your point on exome sequencing, yes, if you have an increased NT plus other structural anomalies like a heart defect, the diagnostic yield hits 40%. But we are debating the standalone NT threshold today.
Right.
For an isolated increased NT, meaning just the fluid is high with no other visible defects, which is exactly what triggers the pathway at 3.0 millimeters, the whole exome sequencing yield is actually a dismal 2.5 to 5.5%. You're suggesting we use an unvalidated, hallucinating AI to trigger the most expensive genomic test we possess, all for a 3% diagnostic return?
Look, I concede your point regarding black box algorithms. The Chen study shows we shouldn't use AI to predict Down syndrome directly from the pixels yet. We need larger, unaugmented data sets for diagnostic prediction. But you are conflating predictive AI with mechanical automation. Automated caliper placement is already a mechanical reality on modern machines, and it is highly effective.
But does it solve the physics problem?
It objectively reduces the intra-operator variability you are so worried about. The AI doesn't need to make a complex genetic diagnosis. It just needs to recognize the fluid boundary and place the cursors on the exact edges, taking the human visual estimation, the squinting at the screen, out of the equation.
Right, but
This ensures the 3.0 millimeter measurement is mathematically consistent every single time. And that consistency is what allows us to confidently offer targeted genetic panels for things like Noonan syndrome, which an isolated NT often flags long before structural heart defects become visible later in the second trimester.
But even with automated calipers, the AI is still placing those cursors on a 2D representation of a 3D biological structure. It is still subject to the exact same acoustic shadowing, the exact same maternal BMI limitations, and the exact same tissue ghosting as the human operator.
It's still an improvement.
The machine will confidently give you a measurement to the third decimal point, but precision is not the same thing as biological accuracy.
It is a massive step closer to it, though.
Think about it. If the AI perfectly and precisely measures a 3.1 millimeter nuchal space, but that space is artificially widened because the fetal neck is slightly extended, an extension the algorithm failed to recognize as non-neutral, it still triggers that massive 93% false positive pathway. The AI just automated the human error. The precision of the tool does not cure the fragility of the premise.
Okay, well, we have covered incredible ground today. To summarize my position in light of this discussion, my stance remains firm. Strict, audited NT measurement is an irreplaceable, comprehensive physiological health marker.
As long as it's perfect.
Exactly. It detects a wide spectrum of structural anomalies and single-gene genetic morbidities that cell-free DNA blood tests simply cannot see. By maintaining rigorous FMF and ISU-AG standards, leveraging automated quality assurance, and intervening at the 3.0 millimeter threshold, we capture significant, life-altering pathologies as early as possible in a pregnancy. We cannot let perfect be the enemy of life-saving.
And my summary is that while NT has undeniable historical value, it was a critical bridge that brought us into modern prenatal care. Its profound vulnerability to operator bias, physics artifacts, and the statistical fragility of its lower thresholds demand a change in practice today.
To the 3.5 cutoff.
Yes, we must adopt more conservative cutoffs like 3.5 millimeters. Doing so protects patients from a systemic cascade of false positives, unnecessary anxiety, and invasive needles. We must stop using a highly sensitive, easily skewed physical measurement as a standalone trigger for major interventions.
I will say, we do have clear areas of convergence. Both of us completely agree on the absolute necessity of rigorous FMF and ISU-OG credentialing. If an NT is letting be measured at all, it must be measured by certified professionals operating under a continuous audit. There is no room for casual measurement in fetal medicine.
Absolutely. And we both strongly agree that cell-free DNA is not a magical substitute for structural ultrasound. You cannot sequence a missing limb, and you cannot sequence a major structural cardiac defect. You have to physically look at the fetus.
But we remain firmly divided on whether the 3.0 to 3.4 millimeter range justifies aggressive standalone intervention. And we clearly disagree on whether AI and automation are currently robust enough to solve the human operator error that plagues the imaging.
We do. And reflecting on this, the profound complexity of integrating traditional anatomical sonography with cutting-edge molecular genetics truly is the defining challenge of modern obstetrics. The continuous evolution of fetal medicine guidelines means there is much more to explore within this rich source material. The science is moving incredibly fast.
Which brings us right back to our telescope. Whether we are peering into the vastness of the cosmos to map a galaxy or zooming in on the millimeter-thin fluid behind a developing fetal neck, the truth of what we see relies heavily on the perfection of the lens, the stability of the instrument, and the wisdom to know when a blur is a vital new discovery and when it is just a smudge on the glass. We leave you to weigh the evidence and form your own conclusion.